Well, welcome everybody to week number 3 of Leading Congregational Worship. My name is Seth Heinrichs. I'm your instructor, and coming to you from St. Paul, Minnesota, where this is the third lecture out of 4 that we've got this J term in this class. And I hope you've been enjoying it so far and getting a lot out of the lectures. This one is going to be a little bit more practical. I'll talk to you about that in just a second, but let's go ahead and get started. First, just a little bit of housekeeping as we think through some of the logistics of our class. I want to congratulate you guys on some seriously awesome online discussions. There are some great ideas being exchanged, I think some new friends being made, some ideas being pushed on, and just some great learning happening and interaction. So really, really wonderful stuff as you're getting ready to move on in the class. I was really just impressed this week with how seriously you're taking the discussions, how much depth of thought that you're putting into it, and I just think that's awesome. Your assignments also are reflecting your effort. That's awesome stuff so far, so keep it up. Again, just been really impressed with your the level of your interaction and how you've been engaging this stuff. Next week, we've got the last lecture coming up. It's hard to believe that this month is just flying by. But next week, we've got our final lecture coming up, and I've placed a forum in our Moodle page that is all about a kind of Ask the Instructor week, where I'm just wanting to take your questions on leading worship, whether it's from a biblical and theological point of view, or whether maybe you have a practical question, maybe just a leadership question about leading a worship committee or a team or something like that. I'm wide open for your questions, and the sky's the limit. So really, I hope that's something that's going to be helpful to you. It would be kind of arrogant for me to think that I could actually tell you everything you need to know about leading worship inside of 4 weeks. It's not. It just doesn't work that way. When I first got into my first church as a 26-year-old senior pastor, I had to do 3 funerals before my first Sunday even started. And I learned an awful lot in those 3 funerals just from the funeral directors and other pastors that were generous with me. So ask away, and I'd be happy to answer your questions as best I can. And then finally, just a word of encouragement about your worship experience assignment. You should be starting to work on that or think that through. If you haven't already, it's time to start thinking about it. So I'm looking forward to reading what you guys come up with for that. All right, today, what I want to do with you just a little bit is talk about this lecture that we have in front of us called From Theory to Practice, Experiencing God in Everyday Community. And really what we're going to do today is we've talked a little bit about the foundations of where we find worship in the Bible and the kinds of issues that come up with that, the fact that there is no one biblical style of worship, but it's clear who our worship is to be to and what it's to be about. We've talked about that, so now we want to take that and let the rubber start meeting the road. We're going to talk today a little bit about a few different, it might seem kind of random, but they're very important elements of leading congregational worship, stuff that when I was in seminary, no one told me, and I'm happy to pass on to you guys. We're going to talk a little bit about planning and prep for worship. We're going to talk about some of your key relationships with regards to leading worship. And we're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about your pastoral identity and how it affects how you understand your role in leading worship within your church, planning it, and all of that kind of stuff. It's kind of an ambitious agenda we've got today. And what I'm going to be doing, again, is just I'm introducing ideas to you and hoping that some of what I pass on is going to be helpful to you as you begin to prepare for leading worship in your own context or even improve your leading of worship in your context. So let's start off talking about going from theory to practice. We've talked about some biblical foundations. Now let's talk about how we practice leading worship. A number of you have brought this question up in some form or another in the online forums, where you've been asking, why is worship such a hot button issue within the church? To put it another way, why can't we all just get along? Why is preference such an issue? Why is worship style such a problem within the church? Why is it that leading worship can be such a hot button item to deal with in the church? One of the reasons, and probably I think the most fundamental reason, is this, and that is that worship is one of the most public and identifiable expressions of a church's identity, both inside and outside the church. It's a funny thing, when you tell people that you're on staff at such and such church, or you're the pastor of such and such church, immediately people already have an impression of both you and your worship style and all of that kind of stuff, either based on something they've experienced at your church or something they've heard about your church, or one time they were a kid and they were brought to VBS and this is what they remember about your church. If they've had any interaction with your church at all, what they will typically remember is your worship style or their worship experience there. Both inside the church and outside the church, it is the most identifiable and probably public expression of a church's identity. And so when we're talking about messing with worship, or I back it up, maybe not messing with worship, but leading worship or changing things in worship, or how do we do worship and experiencing different things and leading people different ways, we aren't just talking about the order of the hymns on Sunday. We aren't just talking about, boy, this week we did the responsive reading before we did the pastoral prayer and it just rocked everyone's world. We're talking, especially for longtime church attenders, about what they identify their church to be all about. So when we're talking about changing worship styles or dealing with worship, understand that we aren't just dealing with something that everybody comes to the discussion with sort of an open book on in our minds and in our hearts. What we're talking about and what we're dealing with is the very heart of who we understand ourselves to be as a community. And as a result, this stuff gets emotional really, really fast. I'll give you a quick illustration. When I was in my first church, we had a very, very much an older congregation, and a lot of folks who were in that church, they lived there since the time they were very, very young in this very small town in east central Minnesota. And so these are folks that grew up together, dated together, got married together, raised their families together, worked their farms together. They've known each other since they were little kids, really, and now they were reaching a stage of life where, after worshiping together for really their whole lives, they were beginning to die together. It was an aging congregation. And as I've mentioned before, we started changing the worship style. We started trying to implement some changes and work things to a point where the worship was perhaps a little bit more reflective of something that might propel the church into a new era or a new chapter of its history. Well, early on, as we were doing things, we were making some room for some different pieces of artwork and bringing in some different pieces into the sanctuary. And there was a large picture of Jesus in sort of, if you're looking at the platform, it was directly in back of the pulpit. And it was one of those old-timey sort of pictures of Jesus where he's sort of sitting by a rock and praying and looking all, ethereal and calm, when really the Bible doesn't describe that scene that way at all. But you probably know the kind of picture that I mean. But it was huge. I mean, this thing had to be at least 60 by 40. It was a giant painting. And in order to make room for some things, we took that painting and we moved it from the front of the sanctuary to the back of the sanctuary. Well, we came in the next Sunday, and I was pulled aside by one of the members of the church who was deeply offended at two things. Number one, that I had removed the picture of Jesus from the front of the church and put it at the back of the church. Understand, this old man was trembling. He was so upset with me. That was the first thing. The second thing was that underneath the painting of Jesus, we had 3 chairs. Maybe your congregation has something different or similar, but there were 3 chairs, and the pastor always sat in one, and there were 2 others that I don't really know why they were there, but they were just always there. They had kind of the 3 thrones up front. And I sat in a different chair that week. Didn't move the chairs, just sat in a different chair. And this old man came up to me. He's trembling. He's angry. And he said, Pastor, number one, I don't like what you've done with moving the picture of Jesus to the back of the church. It's like we're turning our back on the Lord. And number two, you can't sit in the chair where you sat today. And I told him, geez, why is that? What was the issue there with that? He said, because that's where the Lord sits. That's where Jesus sits. Now, I was 26 years old, right out of seminary. I thought the guy was joking around. I told him, well, boy, there's three chairs and God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, so I'm going to have to sit on someone's lap up there. And I started laughing, tried to play it off as a joke. He was not laughing. That was not funny to him. These subtle changes, where the pastor sits, where the art is, what the feel of the room is, when we're messing with stuff like this, when we're dealing or dabbling in worship, we are dealing with the heart of our most identifiable expression of who we are in our church's identity. And sometimes even the littlest things like that can trigger the most emotional of responses. Because a church is something that we, find community in. It's something that for these folks in particular, this was their spiritual community and had been for years. So it's an amazing thing to think that moving a painting or sitting in a chair could be something that triggers that level of emotion. And yet, I will also tell you that was not the last time, nor was it the worst time that we had in that church, where people got emotional, to say the very least, over the issue of worship style or what's going on in the sanctuary. So it is a tricky thing to deal with. And it's also something where we need to remember, or at least need to be told, that worship is an area of our life together in the church where our theory and our practice often diverge. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that primarily is that what you want to do and what you can do tend to be two different things within the life of a church. We can have online discussions, we can read books, we can, discuss different approaches to leadership, worship, all that kind of stuff. What I will tell you all is that what I learned in seminary about the theology of worship and what should go where and all of this kind of stuff, and all of my very lofty ideals in seminary about the kind of worship services I wanted to design, where everybody just sort of got along and understood why we were doing this. The practice of it, in a very practical sense, proved to be much more difficult because you're dealing with human beings who are broken and in powerful spots in the church. And it can be a at times painful process of learning to deal with that and manage those dynamics in a way that doesn't get you fired. So learning to lead through that, learning to accept people where they are, learning to figure out where they are and teach them, educate them, shepherd them, guide them to someplace different, help them to own different ideas. It is tricky stuff. So we're going to pick up the pace here as we keep moving, but I just wanted to say a little bit about that because I think this move, this dynamic shift from theory to practice is a very difficult one, and it's honestly something that I don't know that our seminaries do a great job of helping us negotiate. So hopefully there'll be some nuggets here for you as we get into today. Weekend worship services. Let's talk a little bit about planning and preparation. Weekend worship services are our greatest opportunity to affect the most people at one time every single week. And as a result, that requires our intentionality, that requires planning, and it requires handling those two things responsibly, regardless of what style we're in. I don't care if you're in a liturgical church, a mainline church, a Catholic church, or the most rock and roll church plant out there. Worship services are our greatest opportunity to affect the most people at one time every single week. And that requires our intentionality. It requires our planning and thinking things through. and handling that responsibly, regardless of what style that we're in. There's the old joke about pastors that we only work one day a week. And when I was pastoring churches for 14 years, I mean, I probably heard that joke at least twice a month. Oh, yeah, Pastor, I wish I had your job. You only work one day a week. It's baloney. It's absolute baloney. Now, we know that because many of us in this class are in ministry already, not just seminary. But the whole idea that these messages or these worship services that we take part in just sort of plan themselves or prep themselves, or that we just sort of got up there and shot the bull for 20 minutes during our message this week is ridiculous. Nothing good in a worship service. Well, I'll back off that a little bit. It's rare that a worship service that is not well planned, not well walked through with regards to intentionality, it's rare that service has reached its full dynamic potential for the kingdom. I'll say it that way. We work a lot more than one day a week, and planning this out takes effort. Planning requires knowing what you're trying to plan. Who are we trying to lead in worship, and how are we going to do it? And creativity, in particular, cannot be done very well on the fly. Believe me, this is a lesson I've learned from painful experience. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that messages, any video work you're going to do, if you do that kind of thing, any artistic efforts, any getting congregation people involved, anything that's at all creative cannot be done very well on the fly. Think of like a basketball team. I'm sort of a basketball guy. If we go into the game with no game plan, if we win at all, it's going to be sheer luck. If we go in with no game plan, the chances are we're not going to win. And there are so many distractions that people have, so many reasons people already have these days for not coming to church, that we don't need to give them any more excuses because our worship services weren't well planned. They weren't well thought out. We got to have a game plan. We've got to have some kind of plan of attack with regards to how things are going to flow, who's going to be involved, what creative efforts are we going to be making, how far in advance do we need to be planning those things out, all of that kind of stuff. And who are we trying to lead in worship? If we're not intentional about it, it's just likely not going to reach its full potential. I've got here a list of steps that I want to walk you through. Some of this might seem obvious, and yet sometimes the obvious is the most profound because things get hidden in plain sight, if you know what I mean. But when you're thinking about planning and preparation for your worship services, here are the steps I tend to think of. Step one is just knowing what you're trying to plan. What's the vision for this service? Is it Christmas? Is it Easter? Is it the middle of summer? Is it a baptism service? What is it we're trying to plan, and what's our vision for how this is going to go down? Be crystal clear and state it. This is what I want this worship service to feel like. I encourage you to use descriptive terms using your senses. What do I want people to see? What do I want them to feel? What do I want them to hear? What kind of things, if I were to describe this worship service for you in my head, what do I want them taking away from it? So know what you're trying to plan. Number two, who are you planning it with? And make sure that you're on the same page as the people that you're planning it with. Are you a solo pastor and you are planning this worship service by yourself? Are you bringing other people into this and consulting about this with them? Who does the planning of worship in your church? Who needs to be on board with this? And who do you need to bring into the loop? So you got to know what you're trying to plan. You got to know who you're planning it with, and make sure that you all are on the same page about where you're going with this. And then step three is this. Sorry, I'm going to take a sip of my tea here. Make a plan. My recommendation to you is that at least 4 to 6 weeks out, you should have a plan for every worship service that's going to be happening at your church. And by a plan, I mean either on a spreadsheet or on a computer or a notebook. I don't care what it is. But at least 4 to 6 weeks out, you should be having a plan of attack for your worship services. And I mean a plan that includes every aspect. What music are we singing? What songs are we doing? Who's participating? What Bible passages are we doing? What are the messages on? What's the topic? What are the scriptures that are being used? All of that kind of stuff. Have a plan. If we don't have a plan, then we're up there winging it, and that's just not going to fly. And we're not going to reach our full potential. So make a plan. Actually write it down. And then step 4, again, this seems obvious, but let's say it this way. You got to execute the plan. And by that, what I mean is this. You've got to execute the plan by the month, the week, and the day. So if I've got my worship services planned out 4 to 6 weeks, I know what's coming up. I know if there's a creative element that's going to be coming up 5 weeks from now. I know that I probably need to 2 weeks from now start working on the presentation of that. If it's a creative video, for example, and by the way, I'll talk to you about that in just a second. That's easier and easier to do. If that's not your thing, that's totally okay. But for those of you who maybe are in a context where maybe you're doing a creative video, you've got to know what that is. You've got to have a script ready to go. You've got to have that thing planned out and shooting it at least 3 weeks out. So we've got to plan out our month. And even if it's not a video, let's say it's the participants in worship. Let's say it's the scriptures for our messages, whatever it is. Know what's coming up at least, and have that written down by the month so that stuff that requires advanced work, permissions that you need, people buying into and saying, yes, I'll be at that service and read that scripture, whatever it is, plan it out by the month. Work on it then by the week. What's coming up this week? Are all the I's dotted and the T's crossed with regards to our details? Are all of the pieces put together? And then by the day, what I mean is this. One of the things that I was very fond of doing before our worship services is we had something about 45 minutes prior to our worship service called Holy Huddle, where I brought in everybody, and I mean everybody, greeters, ushers, tech team, worship team, kids people, children's team. I would bring in everybody. We would do a devotional together based on whatever it is we were doing that day. And I'd have a chance to remind them we'd go over the worship order together. We'd talk about any issues that may be coming up in the worship service, make sure all of our transitions are smooth, and make sure that we're all, again, just on the same page. We called it Holy Huddle, and then we'd break and we'd go out and execute the plan. That may seem elaborate to you, and maybe you're sitting back thinking, well, boy, Professor Heinrichs, that's great if you're in a great big church where you've got all these teams and whatever. Listen, I never pastored a church that averaged more than 300 people in a weekend. So I was in rural environments. I brought in everybody, and it just is a great chance to get everybody on the same page. You can do this with regards to whatever context you're in. Execute your plan by the month, by the week, and by the day. It's just a way of being intentional about the execution of your worship services. And then when it's over, evaluate the plan. And if it doesn't work, if an element didn't work, if something you tried didn't work, if an experiment you tried didn't work, cut it out. In fact, I would even say this. Evaluate the plan from the standpoint of your traditions. If it doesn't work, I don't care how long they've been doing it in that church or we've always done it this way. Find a way to cut it out and eliminate it. Work on one thing at a time, but eliminate it. I'll give you a great illustration. At my first church, we used to have one of those pastoral prayer times where we would pause sort of in the worship service and take prayer requests in the middle of the worship service. And I'd write them down and, afterwards I'd pray for them. And I would say a short prayer of, it was kind of flying solo, and then I'd dive into the requests and then pray for those, and then we'd come back, and after that was the message. We did this every single week for at least my first 2 years. Here's what I can tell you about the pastoral prayer time. It was ineffective as a means of worship. Why do I say that? I say that because of a couple things. Number one, the pastoral prayer time oftentimes was something that would become very, very long. I mean, this is something that could take, as short as 3 to 4 minutes, or it could be something that lasts 10 to 15 minutes, depending on if someone gets kind of long-winded and wants to update you on their situation or the situation of their family or share some personal information with you. And so it became this sort of awkward piece of the worship service that was a giant variable every single week. Now, you might say, well, that's, you're giving the Holy Spirit a chance to work. Generally speaking, I would say that might be true, but I would also say that with regards to our worship services in our public worship, we have a responsibility to sort of keep it moving, keep it flowing, not let the service break down or become distracting or something like that. The other thing that was happening is this. Sometimes people would share things that were of such a personal nature that what would happen is, if we were lucky enough to have a visitor in those early years, it became extremely awkward and extremely uncomfortable. Like, oh my gosh, I did not want to know that about you or about your family. This is not a joke. I literally had someone at one point stand up and say, "Would you please pray, Pastor, for the pussy pocky rash on my butt, because it's just driving me crazy." It was an elderly lady, and she wore, I don't know how to say this, adult diapers, but and she was developing some diaper rash, and she wanted us to pray for that. And, I'm thinking, well, we could have the deacons come over and lay hands on you or something. But no, we're not going to do that. But imagine being a visitor in that situation. This just got highly weird. The weird factor just went through the roof. And that might be fine if I've known you for 50 years, like the rest of the people in this church, but it's not okay for the rest of us. So gradually, I started transitioning that time of prayer into a different kind of prayer time that was much less spontaneous and yet still allowed us to pray together. But it was a tradition that they had always done, but I knew right away. I knew in the first worship service I experienced there, we've got to eliminate this because it's problematic from a public worship point of view. And so we did over the course of time. And we did it successfully. But you've got to evaluate your plan. What's working about your worship services? What do you do really, really well? Maybe it's music. Maybe it's preaching. Maybe it's, the fellowship around it. Whatever it is. What do we do well and what do we not do well? Let's accentuate what we do well and shore up our deficiencies a little bit. A couple of you have been asking in the online forums about style transitions. How was I able to move a church that was embedded in one tradition, in a very traditional form of worship, and move them in a direction? I'm going to say a couple of words about this. It's impossible for me to, in the time that we have here today, to give you a full, a sort of full treatment of this. But I'll give you a few pointers about it for those of you that are struggling with it. The first is my encouragement to you is move slow. And as you move slow, develop relationships. Especially when you're new, in a church that has a long-standing tradition, you are the Johnny-come-lately on the scene. And if you're going to have any credibility in this deal, you're going to have to move slow. Don't come in thinking, boy, in 18 months, we're just going to rock the face off this church and it's going to be unbelievable. And we're going to transition it from here to do a 180 inside of those first 18 to 24 months. No, you're not. You're not. Well, let me put it this way. You're not going to do that and keep your job. Move slow. Be patient. Look for openings. Develop relationships. Start to talk to people. Get a feel for who they are and where this stuff all comes from. Even if you don't like it, you need to know where it comes from. Pick one thing at a time. Don't try to change everything all at once. Pick one thing at a time. And you know what I did, and I found this an effective method, is ask lots of leading questions in key arenas. When you're doing your devotional before the board meeting, do it on worship. And then ask lots of leading questions. Boy, it sure seems like they did this in the Bible when they were leading worship. How do you guys think we're doing at that? And then just lead into a discussion. See what comes up in those questions. You'll find very quickly who's going to be on board with you and who isn't. And that's okay. And you need to know that stuff. But just pick one thing at a time. Don't come in with both barrels blazing, ripping stuff apart, and the next thing you know, 2 weeks into your first ministry, you've got a completely different style of work. Now, and that's an exaggeration, but you sort of hear what I'm saying. Move slow, pick one thing at a time, and just start chipping away by asking lots of leading questions. The third thing I would say is recruit help. Don't go it alone. One thing, if you look at the Bible, is that Jesus never sent anybody to do anything alone. Not ever. And understand the dynamics of what we've been talking about. It's more than just a decision to go in a different direction. It is a decision about who we are as a church. Understand that you're going to need help navigating this. The dynamics of this are complicated. We're talking about human relationships here. So when we're talking about transitioning a style, we've got to understand as pastors, as shepherds, as guides, as teachers, as leaders, that this is primarily a relational question. And you're going to need some help figuring out those relationships along the way. The fourth thing I would encourage you about is know what you're moving to and why. Sit down and write it out. Just write it out. In your ideal world, what would this worship service look like in this church with these people in this community? And where are you today? And where do you want to be? And know what you want to get to and why you want to get there. Why do you need to do this? Because there's going to be plenty of opportunity along the way for people to question you. And they will. And sometimes in no uncertain terms. So you need to you're going to have to be able to answer this question. Why are we going there? What are we doing? Reminding people of this, keeping people embedded in this is part of our job. I'll give you a few resources. I've mentioned this one before, Transforming Church in Rural America by Shannon Odell. Just a great, great resource for those of you who are looking to make some changes in your worship style or even just understand the rural church a little bit better. And then another book, it's a little bit dated now, but it's worth taking a look at. It was certainly helpful for me, called Turnaround Churches by George Barna. Boy, I read that book and read quotes in there that I swear he was talking to people in my congregation and reading my email. Just great, great resources there. I hope you'll take advantage of those. Again, we could say so much on this topic, but we got to keep moving on. Just a couple more words about planning and preparation. There's tons of great online help out there. I'm going to say a few words about each of these and keep moving on. This is not a commercial for any of this. I'm not getting paid by any of them. This is unsolicited. But some things to look at that'll help you in your planning and preparation. And again, this is regardless of the size of your church, regardless of the style of your church. Planning Center Online, indispensable tool. Absolutely look into it. I will tell you, when our church moved to Planning Center Online from just spreadsheets and trying to keep things organized ourselves, it just completely transformed our planning and preparation process. Made it so much easier and streamlined. Great, great stuff. The application Pro Presenter, which is available for both Macintosh and PC. I will tell you it works better on the Mac because that's its native language. It was first made for Mac. For those of you who are thinking, boy, I need a better way to do video or motion backgrounds or incorporate different creative pieces, more dynamic pieces into the worship presentation software that we use or whatever, Pro Presenter is an absolute game changer. It is volunteer friendly, it is easy to use, it is not expensive as this stuff goes, and it's highly powerful presentation software. I have used it in classrooms, I've used it in worship centers. This is something you can use if you are a church of 25, and it's something you can use if you're a church of 25,000. And literally that's the range of churches that are using it. Everybody from Andy Stanley's church in North Point, where it was developed, all the way to rural churches in rural America are using this, and it's great, great stuff. Check it out. Other pastors and churches and conferences, I've put a couple links on our Moodle site to 3 talks from the Eaglebrook Church Relevance Conference here in St. Paul. They're a couple of years old now, but really wonderful messages by the staff at Eaglebrook Church and a couple of friends of theirs who are also friends of mine. Eagle Brook Church is the largest church in a 5-state area here in Minnesota, but that's not why I put them on there. There's plenty of things I love about Eagle Brook. I know a lot of people at Eagle Brook. I'm friends with a lot of them. But there's plenty of things I would give pushback on as well, just as many of you have in our online forums. But this conference that they put on, I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but the Relevance Conference, just a fantastic conference for talking about your worship and your worship leading, worship experience. Purely an FYI, I've put those links on Moodle. Check them out. They're worth your time. Especially if you only have time for one of them, listen to the first one, Amazing Calling. Pastor Bob Merritt is talking there, and boy, it's just a powerful, powerful talk. There's 100 other resources you can check out online. New Spring, Elevation, Life Church, YouVersion, the ability to podcast, using iMovie to enhance your worship through video. Actually, even doing video podcasting, it is easier and it is cheaper today than it ever has been. You don't need a giant satellite and huge contracts and whatever to get your ministry out there in the world. Boy, in my church plant that we had, we were in a small town of 3,000 people in east central Minnesota. We had regularly people watching us in Alaska, people watching us in the UK. It's cheap. It's easy to do. There's hundreds of resources out there, no matter what your style or denominational background or whatever, that will help you. I want to talk a little bit about some key relationships as you're thinking about leading congregational worship. Just taking another sip here. All right, key relationships as you're thinking about leading worship. Here's what I want to say in a nutshell, that it is the senior pastor's responsibility to maintain positive relationships with all of those who he or she shares the platform with. Okay? And senior pastors or worship leaders out there, be proactive with your teams and your participants here. I don't care if they're on a paid staff or if they're volunteers or whatever. If they're going to be sharing the platform with you, it is your responsibility, senior pastors, to maintain positive relationships with these people. The reason is this. I don't know what it is, but it's true in big churches and it's true in small churches. And it's true of churches across denominational lines as well. I've seen this firsthand. When people are on a platform in a church, that kind of spotlight does funny things to people. And when you're dealing with worship services, why people are up there, their motivation is absolutely a key factor in how well this worship service is going to go. And when you've got people up there that have competing visions or competing understandings of what's going on and why we're doing it, boy, I will tell you that competing visions ultimately lead to a house divided. And it may take a while to get there, but it'll get there. And when it gets there, it's going to be ugly. It just is the case. You've got to be very much aware of who's involved. Ask yourself the question, at my church, who's involved in planning worship services, in participating in worship services? Maybe your church plans by committee. Maybe it's just a select few people who are planning out the worship services. Maybe your worship services are happening according to a lectionary. Whatever that is, you've got to be very conscious and intentional about who's involved in planning and executing your worship services. There's a lot of different approaches that are valid and acceptable. The point is that no matter what your style is, no matter what your venue or context is, you need to have intentionality. And this is a key point, because the people planning the service and the people on the platform have got to be of like mind, shared vision, and understanding their roles clearly. And as a result, you need to know, who do you need to be communicating with this week? Who do I need to be cultivating a relationship with? Who seems to be the most not on board with where we're wanting to go with this service? All of that kind of stuff. You need to be having your finger on the pulse of this stuff as a leader in your church when it comes to worship. Don't be afraid to creatively recruit people from outside your church if you have to. If you're trying to transition from one style of worship to another style of worship, here's what you need to know. Number one, it's not just a decision that's made in a bubble. This is going to take financial resources. This is going to take human resources. You may not have the people to go where you want to go. Bishop T.D. Jakes is fond of saying that the people who got you there are not necessarily the people that are going to get you there. So even in, if you're like me and you've been in a 120-year-old church, these people don't have the resources to worship, in the way that we ultimately wanted to go to. So we started gradually recruiting from the outside some musicians. I started training up some high schoolers that were already in the church, teaching them how to lead worship. Don't be afraid to utilize the schools, utilize other resources and connections you have. Recruit people to your church as missionaries if you're in the middle of a transition. But do it because the people that are on board with you need to be, or I should say it this way, the people that are going to be on the platform need to be of a like mind. And if they aren't of a like mind, then they either need to come to some sort of understanding about this, or you need to get people up there who are on board with you. So don't be afraid to recruit from outside. I want to say a special word here to those of you who are either going to be senior pastors or already are senior pastors, and your relationship to worship and music leaders in the church. This is an area where serious conflict is all too common among these two groups of people: senior pastors, worship leaders, music leaders, however that's defined in your context. These two people are the most visible people in your church. They are the face of your church. And this is a critical relationship to the health of your church. In fact, I would say it as strongly as this: your worship services are only going to be as healthy as the relationship between these two people. And if there are issues there, gang, act quickly to resolve them. I put the onus on the senior pastor to initiate that, but I tell you what, work quickly to resolve them, because those issues, once they blow up, are so divisive in a church. The music has got to serve the vision of the church and the vision of the worship service. And if it doesn't, it needs to be changed. And if it needs to be changed, it's going to have to be slow, gradual, ask your questions, all that kind of stuff. Nobody shows up next Sunday with a totally different worship style, okay? But if the music is not serving the vision of the church and the vision for a particular worship service, if you're getting pushback from a musical leader, if there's tension in this relationship between the senior pastor and the worship or music leader, gang, it's a recipe for church-wide trouble and potentially a church-wide split. In the last several years, I know of at least 6 to 8 situations just of personal friends of mine that have gone through it. And it's horrible, it's difficult, it's divisive, and it doesn't serve the body of Christ well. So what I would tell you is that maintaining boundaries here is critical. And by that, I mean both the senior pastor and the worship or music leader need to understand their role. Worship leaders need to understand that they are there to serve the vision of the church. They are there to pave the way and soften hearts through musical worship to receive the word of God. And if they don't understand that, then there's going to be trouble. Senior pastors need to be able to also, likewise, give people enough creative freedom that they don't feel stifled. So give them freedom, but within some strong limits and some strong boundaries between who is the ultimate, where does the buck ultimately stop, who's making decisions, all of that kind of stuff. But really maintaining these boundaries is absolutely critical. Know your role. What I'll tell you is that pride is usually the source of the conflict. Whether it's a senior pastor that's coming down hard on a worship and music leader, or a worship and music leader who feels stifled by a senior pastor and therefore is unconsciously undercutting him all the time, or her all the time. Pride is usually the source of conflict. And it was true for Satan as he was jettisoned from heaven. It's true for all of us as well. Guys, we are broken people in a broken world leading broken people in worship. And our pride, for those of us who are on the platform every single week, pride is a particularly sneaky bugger of an animal to deal with. Whether it's inside of ourselves or whether it's in our teams or whatever. And so that's just usually the case. So just be conscious of this stuff going into it. That is a delicate relationship, and I'd really encourage you to be especially conscious of the way you deal with that. Let's talk for just a second about pastoral identity. And it's just a great segue from where we've been to talk about these questions around pastoral identity and who plans your worship services in your church. And why is that the case? For a lot of us, it depends on the tradition of our church, the denominational preferences and styles. But you need to be very clear about this question. No matter what role you are on staff, if you're a solo pastor in a church of 50, or if you are a pastor of a church of 5,000, you need to know who is it that's planning the worship services and why. Sometimes we ask people in our churches to do things that they don't know how to do. Key question in the Bible is that when the people in the Bible were asked to take a vote on almost anything, ask yourself this: how did things work out? Did the people in the congregation, so to speak, whether they were the children of Israel or whatever, did the people of the Bible tend to know what was best by consensus? Or did they need strong leadership in figuring out how to handle even issues regarding worship? It's just kind of an interesting thing to think about. When people took a vote, generally speaking, they did not vote for God's will in the Bible. Here's a similar question. When the people throughout the scriptures, were asked what they wanted to do, how did that turn out for them? What was the end result? Now, how you go about this in your church is going to depend on your ecclesiology, church polity, all that kind of stuff, and that leads into much broader questions than we have time to get into today. But here's the point I'm trying to make. When pastors, particularly senior pastors, solo pastors, when pastors who are educated, trained, apprenticed, who are in this stuff and around this stuff, who've learned the Bible, when pastors abdicate responsibility for planning worship services to lay people, oftentimes bad things happen. And as an example, you can look up Exodus 32 and ask yourself how the whole golden calf incident went down when Aaron asked the people what they wanted to do. It's one example. Now, I realize that for a lot of you, this statement might make you bristle a little bit. I'm okay with that. What I'm trying to get at is this idea that if I were like an auto mechanic, and I don't think about church more than a couple hours a week, one of them being the week that I'm there, or maybe even 25 minutes during the week when I'm not at church. If I'm just kind of an auto mechanic going about my day, I'm not trained in the Bible. I'm not trained in leading worship. I'm not trained in preaching and teaching, but I serve on my church board and I help make decisions because I'm on the worship committee about what's going to happen in worship. There's nothing wrong with involving people in worship or getting feedback. That's not the point. The point is this, that pastors need to be the ones who are teaching, who are planning, who are educating their parishioners, their congregants about what worship is and how we do this, reminding them of here's where we are, here's where we're trying to go, here's the vision for this service. If I were to go to that same auto mechanic and tell him, you know what, don't worry about the transmission in my car. I know you've diagnosed it as needing a new transmission. I think I'm going to go home and do it myself because, it's got to be a YouTube video on it or something. Listen, I'm the kind of guy that, believe me, you don't want me doing that to my car. You don't want to hand me a scalpel and say, here, go do surgery on somebody. Why? Because I have no idea what I'm doing. I've never been trained in this. I've never really even thought about doing that. So if that's the case, then we need to, as pastors, be aware of where people are coming from as we're coming to this conversation of how we're going to plan worship and who's going to participate in that discussion. Where are they coming from? What kind of devotional, what kind of education, what kind of teaching, what kind of edification of the body do we need to do so that these people are qualified, that we can help them understand the biblical purposes of worship and all this kind of stuff and help them to make good decisions. Dallas Willard has this wonderful quote, and he's just one of my favorite Christian thinkers, let alone human beings, that has ever been alive. But this is what he says. He says, we must consider that our lives and our churches are perfectly designed to get the results that we're currently getting. I'm going to say that again. We must consider that our lives and our churches are perfectly designed to get the results we are currently getting. Gang, it is our job as leaders in the church, as seminarians, as people who have roles on staff, as people who have taken it upon ourselves to get trained up in the ministry, which, by the way, is a biblical thing to do. We got to take it on ourselves to sort of look at this situation of congregational worship in our churches and say, look, if we're not happy with the results we're getting, then something needs to change. It's that old Einstein definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. If your worship service isn't taking you where it should be taking you, if it's not doing what it should be doing, if it's not accomplishing what it should be accomplishing, then we need to consider that our practices are part of the problem, and we need to teach and preach and communicate and educate and edify the body so that we can get to a point where we're moving in the right direction again. Who we understand ourselves to be as pastors invariably is going to shape how we lead congregational worship. Okay? What do I mean by that? I mean that if you consider yourself to be more passive, then you're going to approach things one way. If you consider your role to be more active, you're going to approach it another. I'll give you an example. I have a pastor friend of mine who came to me one day and said, Seth, man, I'm just struggling. I'm just struggling in my church. My church is struggling with this whole idea of worship and what it's going to look like, and we can't decide whether we want to have pews or chairs in the worship center. All of our traditionalists want pews. They feel it's almost unspiritual to not have the pews. Other people want chairs. By the way, isn't this a great example, too, of how petty we can get about worship is not about what you're sitting your butt in, right? Worship is about where you're directing your heart. That's a whole nother lecture. But this was his solution. I listened to him for a long time. He went back to his church and came up with this solution all on his own. He said, what I decided to do is I tried to help people come to a compromise. That was my leadership role. And so what we did is we took out the pews in the back half of the church and we put chairs in there, but we left the pews in the front of the church. So that way we're trying to make everyone happy. And then I asked him, so is everybody happy now? And he said, no, they're not. And I said, why not? He said, because now nobody's happy. Nobody feels like they got what they wanted. But that was my leadership decision because here I am, trying to help them just get along with each other. He views his pastoral identity as being a much more passive presence in his congregation, in the sense of he sees himself as being a consensus builder. He sees himself as being someone who's helping people deal with their issues by coming to compromises. In the middle of that, he's not teaching them about worship. He's not preaching to them about worship. He's not standing up and saying, this is our vision of where we need to go as a church. He's not, he's abdicating that responsibility to the people of the church and asking them, I don't know, what do you guys want to do? Well, of course, they can't agree, so he's trying to fix that element of it. When really, that just becomes a process of managing symptoms rather than treating the disease. If we want to get people's eyes on Jesus in the middle of our worship services, then we need them to understand that it's not about what you're sitting in, it's about what you're standing for. By the way, that'll preach. I'll tell you that right now. But that's the point. You've got to lead into that. You've got to preach that and teach that. That needs to be in your Bible studies. It needs to be in your small groups. That needs to be something that is pervading your ministry so that you are attacking a misunderstanding of what the Bible has to say. That's my approach. That's a much more active role in managing the problem. Will that come with more conflict and hard conversations? Yes. Will you keep your job longer the other way? Maybe. Maybe. But what I will tell you guys is that how you understand these issues is largely going to be informed by how you understand your pastoral identity. What kind of presence is God asking me to be with this church? Am I a passive presence, or am I an active shepherd who's helping the sheep that are falling behind keep up, moving them in the right direction, and protecting them from wolves? Which one am I? Our calling is to lead, to shepherd, to guide, teach, facilitate, guard, never abdication. Be clear on who you are and what your role is as a worship leader and as a pastor, whether it's on staff as a senior leader or not, because guys, that is going to play itself out both consciously and unconsciously in your ministry. And the more you can become aware of that, the better your leading of worship is going to be. I hope you've enjoyed lecture number 3 on going practical and going from theory to practice. Guys, these are just some things I wish someone would have shared with me as I was getting ready to launch into my first ministry and leading worship. Again, if there are specific questions about leading worship that we haven't covered yet, or if you haven't come across in your reading, please feel free to email or put those in the forum that is on Moodle, and I'll try to group them together and answer as many as I can and have time for next week. But I'm sure I've given you a lot to chew on here, and there's going to be plenty of things that you're going to that are going to strike you as, wow, that's a great idea, plenty that you won't. What I always like to say, gang, is eat the fish and spit out the bones. Take what's valuable for you, spit out what isn't, and hopefully it's just a way to help you start thinking about these issues and dealing with them in your ministry as you think about how to become a better leader of congregational worship. Best advice I can give you is to if you want to improve the worship in your church, improve your own personal worship. If you do that, you will invariably start to improve the worship of your church. And that means understanding who you are as a pastor, a leader, a shepherd, and a worshiper who comes before God with his congregation and leads them into his presence every week. Have a great week, everybody. Keep up the great chatting online. Been wonderful to chat with you again this week, and keep those conversations going and get those questions in. I look forward to seeing what you come up with.